Intimacy is the thing that brings us the most joy, and yet it's what many people run from the fastest. Alain de Botton. Have you ever been in a relationship that started like a dream, but ended in painful silence? He once loved you with intensity, told you that you were the only one who made him feel safe, and then, suddenly, he vanished. No explanation, no clear reason, just emptiness. You wonder, what did I do wrong? Was I too much? Or not enough? The truth is, you did nothing wrong. You simply loved someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style, someone who's terrified of being seen, terrified of being loved, and terrified of their own feelings. In a society where we're taught to be strong, independent, need no one, many people grow up believing that love is dangerous. What they don't realize is that emotional neglect in childhood taught them that attachment equals loss of control. And you, with your open heart, became the biggest threat to their nervous system. If you've ever been abandoned like this, or you're hurting right now from someone who comes close, then pulls away, then comes back only to hurt you again, this video is for you. Today, we're going to break down how avoidants love, why they withdraw, and how you can stop being pulled into that painful emotional loop ever again. Here's something few people are willing to admit. Avoidantly attached individuals never walk into love by accident. They may appear detached, indifferent, even cold, but behind that calm, "I don't need anyone" exterior is a heart that has shattered so many times, it had no choice but to freeze in order to survive. They often enter new relationships not when they're ready, but when the pain of loneliness becomes unbearable. That loneliness usually follows the collapse of a difficult relationship, often with a narcissistic partner, another avoidant, or someone who constantly made them feel like they weren't enough. These past connections left them wounded, with a lingering belief that love equals pain. And then, they meet you. You're not like the others. You're warm, but not overwhelming. You listen without judging. You give them space, but never disappear. You are exactly the kind of emotional anchor their inner abandoned child has always longed for, strong enough to lean on, gentle enough not to shame them. And because of that, their nervous system floods with dopamine and hope. They begin to believe, maybe I can love after all. But what they don't realize is, they're loving from the part of themselves that is still wounded. Not long after, the love bombing begins, often unconsciously. They text every day, call constantly, ask to see you all the time, talk about commitment, future plans, maybe even say, "I love you" within weeks. From the outside, it feels like deep, intense love, but in reality, it's often infatuation, fueled by the relief of having finally found someone who quiets their pain. Psychologists call this an infatuation-based connection, when a person is attached to the feeling of love, not to the actual person in front of them. The avoidant isn't seeing you clearly. They're seeing a version of you that their trauma needs you to be, and they don't know it yet, but they're placing enormous expectations on the relationship and on you. At first, everything feels amazing, but something deeper is already brewing beneath the surface. They're not loving like a secure adult. They're loving like a child seeking healing. And that kind of love, while real, is fragile. Too fragile to survive the inevitable truth that you are human, not perfect. You will, inevitably, disappoint them. Maybe you don't respond quickly to a text. Maybe you're busy and cancel a plan. Maybe you express a need or an emotional truth. To their nervous system, trained to believe that closeness equals danger, any sign of real emotional intimacy can be misinterpreted as a threat. And so, the retreat begins, even though you haven't changed at all. And then, the inevitable happens. After a few months, typically between month 4 and month 8, the dopamine high begins to fade. Everything that once felt thrilling, hopeful, and full of promise now starts to feel ordinary. There's no longer the rush of rescue, no longer the euphoria. What's left is a real relationship with two real humans, and an emotional closeness that's deepening by the day. And that's when the avoidant begins to unravel inside. All the suppressed emotions, anxiety, shame, fear of losing control start to surface. And because their nervous system has never learned how to process closeness safely, this intimacy, something they longed for, is now interpreted by their brain as a threat. They don't consciously realize they're scared. They simply feel, something's wrong. I feel trapped. I feel pressure. And so, the defense mechanisms kick in like a reflex. They'll discover how weak I really am. If they see the real me, they'll leave just like everyone else did. I better pull away before they get the chance to hurt me. They don't say these thoughts out loud. In fact, they're usually unaware of them, but their behavior starts to shift dramatically. The daily affection turns into unpredictable silence. The talk of the future becomes vague. The warm touches give way to invisible cold walls. And you, the one who loves them, start to feel that shift. You don't understand what's happening. You wonder, did I do something wrong? Am I asking for too much? Should I be more patient? You start adjusting yourself to be easier for them, but every effort you make only pushes them further away. Because now, you're no longer the person who made them feel loved. You've become the person who's triggering their deepest fears. To cope with this fear, the avoidant unconsciously activates a familiar sequence: find faults, assign blame, withdraw. They begin seeing you through a more critical lens. What once drew them to you now becomes a problem. You're too emotional, too needy, too demanding. They might even start reminiscing about an ex, someone who once caused them great pain. But now, their mind is looking for any excuse to avoid facing their own wound. Because if they admitted that this emotional chaos came from within, they'd have to confront the wound they've been avoiding their entire life. I don't know how to love. I don't know how to be close without fear. I don't believe I'm lovable just as I am. And that truth is too painful to face. So, they push you away, not because you aren't good enough, but because you're getting too close to their truth. Here lies a bitter paradox. The avoidant may leave the relationship because of the good things you give them. Not because you hurt them, but because your kindness makes them feel undeserving. In the avoidant's inner world, intimacy isn't a destination, it's a danger zone. They want love, but they can't tolerate the emotional intensity that love brings. So instead of facing it, they do what they've always done: withdraw into silence. They might say they need time, or that something just doesn't feel right. They start creating distance, getting busier, less connected, more irritable over small things. And you fall into a spiral of pain. You feel rejected and confused. You begin doubting yourself. But the truth is, you didn't do anything wrong. You simply got too close to someone who isn't ready to handle the light you shine on their inner shadows. This is the beginning of what we call the avoidant cycle. Love, closeness, fear, withdrawal, return, withdrawal again. A never-ending loop unless someone decides to stop and look within. But their withdrawal doesn't stop at distance. It's not just fewer calls, fewer texts, or less "I love you." When the pressure builds inside them to a point they can no longer tolerate, they do the most devastating thing. They disappear. No warning, no explanation, no honest goodbye. One day, they just stop replying. No more messages, no more calls, not even a clear signal. And for them, that moment feels like relief, liberation. No more emotional responsibility. No more fear of failure or being exposed. No more pressure to be good enough. They've returned to their safest place, emotional detachment. But for you, it's a complete emotional collapse. You don't just feel abandoned, you feel discarded, worthless, like someone who could be forgotten overnight, even after being so deeply loved. You start asking yourself over and over, why did this happen? What did I do wrong? What changed? And then you begin to carry guilt that was never yours to begin with. But the truth is, when an avoidant suddenly cuts off a relationship, they're not punishing you. They're rescuing themselves from the internal chaos that's been boiling beneath the surface. The breakup isn't thought out logically, it's driven by a survival response. Their brain has decided, love equals pain, closeness equals danger, and you, the one getting too close, have become the biggest threat of all. Ironically, they don't even leave in anger. They leave in panic, not because you did something terrible, but because you came too close to the part of them they've buried their whole life. And to avoid facing that pain, they cut things off. But not to move on. They cut things off to avoid. Tragically, after the breakup, the avoidant often doesn't feel as crushed as you do. In fact, they feel relieved. They breathe easier, like they just escaped some pressure they couldn't name. They throw themselves into work, travel, gym, friends, anything to help them not think about you. On social media, they may look like they're living their best life. But beneath the performance is a nervous system that's gone completely numb. That's not healing. That's emotional shutdown. Because they never learned how to sit with pain without drowning in it. They never developed the emotional capacity to feel loss and stay present. All they know is, if I avoid, I won't hurt. So they move forward. No closure, no accountability, no conversation to help you make sense of what happened. They leave you with silence and a heart full of unanswered questions. This is the most brutal phase of avoidant attachment. The absence that feels cruel but comes from someone too fragile to stay. What makes this more heartbreaking is this: you don't know it was the last time. You still hope. You think maybe they just need space. You believe love like that doesn't disappear so easily. But what you don't know is, they've already made the decision to cut it off. Not because they stopped loving you, but because they were too afraid to keep loving you. And when you reach out texts, calls, emotional pleas, they go silent again. Because to them, every message from you is more pressure. Pressure to feel. Pressure to face the consequences of what they did. Pressure to step back into the very space they've trained themselves to fear. People often ask, do they even hurt? Yes, but they shove it down just like they've done their entire life. They don't allow themselves to feel because if they feel, they might break. You want to scream. You want answers. But the most painful truth is, they can't give you that, not because you don't deserve it, but because they're not well enough to give it to themselves. And from here, a new chapter begins, one where they think they've finally escaped you. But when you finally disappear for real, when your texts stop, your presence fades, their avoidant nervous system begins to shift again. From relief to emptiness. From running to regret. From denial to obsession. But that is a story for the next part. Strange, isn't it? They were the one who left, the one who cut you off, who fell silent, who abandoned you in the chaos. But the moment you truly disappear, when you stop texting, stop asking, stop chasing, they begin to come back. Not with an apology, not with clear words, but in ways ambiguous. A vague text at midnight. Hey, how have you been? A sudden like on your story. A question passed through a mutual friend. They don't say they miss you, but you feel it. They don't admit regret, but you sense it in their reappearance. These are breadcrumbs, tiny crumbs of attention scattered not to truly re-enter a relationship, but to test. Do you still want me? Do I still matter to you? Am I still valuable, even after I left like that? And if you respond gently, kindly, even warmly, they immediately pull away again. Because remember, closeness equals risk of being hurt. Loving you equals the possibility of being truly seen. And to them, that is still the most dangerous thing of all. And so, the cycle repeats. Reach out, intimacy, trigger, withdrawal, false hope. They inch closer. Get a moment of comfort knowing you're still there. Then fear rises again, and they retreat. You feel hopeful again. You feel disappointed again. You feel the pain all over again. This cycle doesn't just exhaust your emotions, it distorts your sense of self-worth. You start believing you're too needy, too emotional, too intense. You begin to think you are the reason they avoid love. But the truth is, they've been afraid of intimacy long before they ever met you. You didn't create the wound. You simply touched it with your genuine love. And the painful irony? They may only feel safe when you're distant, detached, or emotionally unavailable. When you become less present, they feel more free to approach. Not because they've matured emotionally, but because your disconnection feels less threatening to their system. At that point, they may reinitiate with more enthusiasm, ask to meet, suggest starting fresh, or share a fleeting moment of vulnerability. And if you say yes, the honeymoon phase may return briefly. Dopamine comes back. Hope returns. You think, maybe this time will be different. But once intimacy creeps in again, a simple request, a real emotional need, a moment of truth, their old wound is triggered all over again. And just like that, they pull away again, as if they never return. This cycle can repeat many times over months, even years. And each time they return and leave, they drag you deeper into a hole of false hope and real pain. What's worse is, avoidants often don't realize they're doing this. In their minds, they're just unsure, figuring things out, confused about their feelings. But for you, every approach and retreat is another emotional fracture. They don't see that their inconsistency is your deepest insecurity. And you don't realize that as long as you stay in this cycle, you're slowly abandoning yourself. And then, one day, You stop. You no longer reply. You no longer wait for them to come back. You no longer leave the door open. And in that moment, when you truly vanish from their emotional control, a new shift begins. The emptiness they once used you to escape is now inescapable. The false confidence they used to suppress their pain begins to crack. This is the crossroads between illusion and truth, between avoidance and real loneliness. And that opens the door to part 5, the deep root, childhood psychology, and the buried shame wound. Avoidant attachment isn't just a behavior pattern in relationships. It's the emotional legacy of a child who was mentally and emotionally abandoned. They were raised in homes where emotions were not allowed or were only conditionally accepted. Expressions of pain, vulnerability, sadness, fear were dismissed, shamed, or outright ignored. When they cried, adults said, "Stop being dramatic, toughen up." When they were afraid, they heard, "It's nothing, don't be weak." When they needed comfort or reassurance, they were met with silence, criticism, or coldness. So they came to a quiet, heartbreaking conclusion. My emotions are wrong. If I want to be loved, I have to disconnect from who I really am. At the core of the avoidant is deep shame around simply having emotion. They carry the toxic belief, I only have value when I'm strong, successful, and don't need anyone. If I show vulnerability, I'll be rejected. And if someone sees the real me, they'll leave. This is why they develop a survival strategy, to detach from their emotions in order to be loved. They grow up to become competent, high-functioning, disciplined, achievement-oriented adults, but they never learn how to feel safe while needing someone emotionally. Now, in adult relationships, they repeat that same strategy. If you knew the real me, you'd leave. This isn't a spoken statement. It's a deeply wired belief, one their nervous system carries like a scar. A fear so primal, it makes even healthy closeness feel like a threat. You express a need, they hear, "You're too much." You share sadness, they feel overwhelmed. You cry in front of them, they feel helpless, and more importantly, ashamed. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system was never trained to stay present when emotions arise. It only knows two modes, control or escape. To love you, to listen to you, to sit with your feelings, unconsciously takes them back to the helpless child they once were, the one who was made to believe emotions equals weakness. So they revert to their oldest reflex, avoid. But what once worked to survive childhood now becomes a disaster in adult love. Because you can't build connection with someone who runs every time real emotions enter the room. Here's the bitter truth. Avoidants often believe they're protecting others from being hurt, when in reality, they're recreating the very pain they went through. Once, their feelings were ignored. Now, they ignore yours. The cycle repeats not through words, but through nervous systems. And the only thing that can stop that cycle isn't you loving them harder. It's them waking up to the realization, I'm not withdrawing because they're wrong for me. I'm withdrawing because I never learned how to stay. When an avoidant finally confronts their core pain, the shame of being emotionally vulnerable, they arrive at a turning point. They either continue blaming others and repeating the pattern, or they pause, look inward, and begin the real healing journey. If they choose that second path, if they dare to face their own avoidance, only then does something truly powerful begin to happen. They can learn to love like an adult, not through control, not through distance, but through presence. Even if afraid, even if trembling, they choose to stay. But to do that, they have to relearn everything. How to express emotions without being shamed. How to connect without feeling swallowed. How to need someone without feeling worthless. And that leads us into part 6, the solution. The way out begins with emotional responsibility. Avoidance can change, not by finding the right person, not by searching for someone who feels less intense, but only when they are brave enough to face themselves. When the emptiness can no longer be filled with work, travel, or casual flings. When every escape route leads to the same dead end, loneliness and the same old shame that was never truly faced. Only then can they finally see. Avoidance isn't a personality, it's a choice. An unconscious choice, repeated over and over, and deeply painful. And the paradox is this. It is often in the moment when they feel most lost, most broken, that the real journey can begin. Not with promises, but with emotional responsibility. They seek therapy, not to fix themselves, but to understand that they've gone years without allowing themselves to feel. They begin reconnecting with themselves, to know what they feel, what they want, what they fear. They learn to sit with anxiety without disappearing, to say, "I'm not okay, but I'm still here." They begin replying to messages, not because they have the perfect answer, but because they want to take responsibility for their own emotions and the impact they have on others. They begin to love without needing to control, without needing to run. This isn't a magical transformation in a few weeks. It's a journey, and that journey only begins when they choose integrity. Integrity, in this context, doesn't mean perfection. It means choosing to stay even when every part of them wants to flee. And from that foundation of responsibility, of healing, something beautiful can begin to grow. Emotional presence.